what is at the heart of a classic horror film? In particular, a transcendent horror film that was also transitional. The original Texas Chainsaw Massacre both reinvented the genre for a modern audience and at the same time provided a higher level experience than anything that had come before it. And maybe anything that's come since. Making sequels to the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre always was problematic because how do you top what was a moment in time? A film that single-handedly defined a generation of horror, even though that generation never lived up to the promise of that first film. Now, I don't want to overstate it. I don't think Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the ultimate horror film. I don't think you can really just give that award to any one film. There's things that it does so exceptionally well that it's hard not to see it as a top-tier horror film. But there's things that it doesn't do at all. I would argue that creating likable characters that we genuinely care about is one of them. How do you make another chapter in a series that never needed even a second film? Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 looked to satire of the Reagan-esque landscape for its answer, and New Line Cinema, when they got a hold of the series, made a very commercial horror film in the mold of their Nightmare on Elm Street or Paramount's Friday the 13th series. Neither approach really worked. Hooper's film is great on its own, as its own thing. Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3 has nostalgia on its side at this point, but it's only gained it because of age, not necessarily quality. So we get to the fourth film, initially titled The Return of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and featuring the return of the original screenwriter, Kim Henkel. It seemed as if the stars were going to align, and we were going to get a legitimate sequel to the original. How? Who knew? As fans at the time, we were excited to see where this went. Would this be another gritty, in-your-face, backwoods terror fest? That's what we wanted. I think that's what most of us wanted, anyway. What we got, ultimately, retitled and repackaged as Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Next Generation, was something quite different. Now, in my last installment, I stated that Leatherface Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3 is my least favorite of this franchise. And it's a troubled franchise, keep that in mind. I can completely understand how someone would feel that this film is the worst, or that something that came later was the worst. But herein lies the big conundrum of the series. If you don't try something new, you're going to fail in a head-to-head competition with the original. But if you try something new, some of the fan base simply won't like it. So the franchise has always had to deal with the fact that it will continue to splinter, like a tree, into branches and finally into twigs. This film represents a very odd branch of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre family tree, but you can't say it didn't try to do something. And to me, that gives it a certain strength, even though the film itself is undeniably weak. What we have here is not the social satire of the second film, or the cynical money-making attempt of the third. What you have here is a parody of the original film that wants to be taken seriously as a sequel as well. And that's a strange thing, because you're talking about jumping genres from horror to horror comedy of a sort, but then also asking the original fan base to come along for the ride. It's a tricky maneuver, and one that they don't really pull off. But, again, would you rather see a direct sequel to Leatherface's Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, whereas Leatherface is posited as a supervillain like Freddy or Jason? I don't want that. Now, there's a part of the audience that does, and I'm not meaning to diminish their viewpoint, but at this point in the franchise's history, it was pretty plain to see that something needed to change. Something needed to innovate if this title was to go forward as some sort of franchise. So Henkel didn't necessarily have the wrong idea here at all. He just chose a steep mountain to climb, and that mountain had dead bodies lying all the way to the top, just like Mount Everest. Everything is the same, but presented as ridiculous. The trademark flashbulb sound that opened the original is used to open this film again, but the context is changed meaningfully. In the original, it was meant to represent a crime scene photograph being taken at the site of a grave desecration. The body has been excavated from its grave and propped up on a monument. It's a horrifying moment, and that sound, that very recognizable but now very sinister sound, antique and disturbing in all the right ways, is now played for parody. We hear that disturbing sound again, but now it's just prom photos being taken, which logically makes no sense, of course. By the early 90s, that sort of flash photography was no longer being used. But it doesn't matter, because the movie is never going for a realistic tone. It's going instead for a highly texturized and stylized vision of film. It's intentionally dark and dirty and grimy and sometimes out of focus. And that is sort of the aesthetic of the original, but the original felt authentic, and this always feels like an attempt to replicate rather than something organic. The film progresses exactly as you'd expect, with victims being offed and captured and tortured, and finally we get to a dinner scene. Unlike the previous films, this time we get a massive left turn in the form of an Illuminati subplot, which is simultaneously underdeveloped and in your face. There's bizarre imagery, there's suggestions of aliens, conspiracies, it name checks the Kennedy assassination, and I think it does that last thing for a purpose. The look of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is very much in line with the look of the Zapruder film of the Kennedy assassination. That same sort of violence is present in both films, and what had once been an extremely disturbing reminder of American history in the original horror film is now kind of cynically played as a joke. And that tells you a lot about the tone of this movie, where the assassination of a U.S. president basically becomes a in-joke. The original final chase is reenacted here, but this time we have a plane that comes to the rescue inexplicably. It's a film where anything can happen, and probably does. So, what to make of this film? What should we think of it? Truth is, it's a mess. And it's probably an unresolvable mess, because the original idea to make both a parody and a legitimate sequel simultaneously in the same package is really unworkable. But at the same time, I'm impressed that they would try such a high-minded idea in a franchise like this. So, the real question is this a good film? No, it's not a good film. Is it an entertaining film? That depends on you. Is it worth watching to find out whether you like it or not? And that's where I'd have to say yes. This is exactly the sort of film I feel you need to see before you purchase. So while you're not going to find a repertory showing of this at a theater anytime soon, you certainly can rent a stream of it and check it out before you spend the big money to buy some deluxe edition of the film. So this Confused chapter neatly identifies with its times. The early 90s for the horror genre were a confusing time. A decade earlier, there had been huge hits on a regular basis, and the popularity of the genre was skyrocketing. But in the early 90s, it dive-bombed. No one really knew where to go with the horror genre to keep it vital. And just before the Great Horror Drought, this film threw its hat in the ring. It didn't know what to do either, so it tried something. Something courageous and bold and doomed to failure, but it tried something. Whether it was worth it, whether it's a film you need to revisit often, or whether you see once, shrug, and never look back on, is totally up to you. But to me, it represents a moment in the genre's history that we deserve to investigate at least once.